Welcome to this psychophilosophical spoken word internet series, Inalienable Paradise. This is aimed to providing stories and tactics to help people, even in the most traumatic and inescapable of circumstances, to help people with things universally accessible overcome such circumstances or feelings of terror, worthlessness, and helplessness. We hope we will provide the help that so many people need, and that you will find at least some value in this. Thank you. All right, thank you everyone for tuning in on this edition of Inalienable Paradise. I present before all of you with a deep sense of obligation, striving to express a sentiment that I believe we all share and need to express. So I'm going to start off with the central theme of this installment is going to be my profound admiration for the great Peruvian poet César Vallejo. Vallejo gave us something remarkable in his poetry, something that meets the human condition with uncompromising honesty. In particular, he gifted us a poem that dares to, quote-unquote, talk about hope, that dares to talk about it, while plumbing the deepest wells of despair. I owe a debt of gratitude to those who preserved and translated his words, and above all to Vallejo himself, for setting standards of sincerity and emotional intensity as high as he did, and for bringing off this truly extraordinary achievement in literature. I will speak today about the importance of hope, about what we expect hope to do for us, and what its significance is in the broader development of the human spirit. To discuss the significance of hope, we must first consider the context in which hope operates, namely the inescapable universality of suffering, which is, of course, the central theme of this entire series. It might seem paradoxical, but to appreciate hope, we have to visualize its position against suffering, much as a faint star is best seen against a dark night sky. As Dostoevsky says, the darker the night, the brighter the stars. The deeper the pain, the closer is God. Well, Vallejo's work helps us visualize exactly that. His insight was that suffering is a fundamental element of life, one that transcends all the labels and identities that we typically cling to. We have reached a stage of understanding where we can see pain not as something that sets us apart, but rather as something that unites us in a shared human experience. Vallejo expressed this with striking clarity when he wrote that I think I'm paraphrasing, he does not feel this suffering as César Vallejo, not as a creative person, or as even a man, not even as a simple living being. He doesn't feel it as a Catholic or a Muslim or an atheist either. Quote unquote, today I am simply in pain. He declares in these lines, Vallejo removes all social, religious, and personal qualifiers from his pain. His suffering is not a matter of identity. It's much deeper than that. It's pure suffering. So suffering without identity is suffering multiplied. The kind that could afflict anyone and everyone regardless of who they are. Having, of course, established that suffering is universal, Vallejo goes further to suggest that some pain defies explanation altogether. We human beings often ask, why do I suffer? What caused this pain? We seek reasons, of course, first, a loss, a trauma, an injustice, something to point to. But Vallejo confronts us with the unsettling idea that profound pain can exist without any cause at all. quote unquote, my pain is so deep that it never had a cause and has no need of a cause, end quote. He writes, nothing caused it, and nothing could have stopped being its cause. In other words, there are sorrows that simply are, that arise within like a spontaneous generation of anguish. He asks rhetorically, why has this pain been born all on its own? And he offers an image as an answer. Quote unquote, my pain comes from the north wind and from the south wind, like those hermaphrodite eggs that some rare birds lay conceived of the wind. In this vivid metaphor, pain is portrayed as a self-conceived entity, born of the wind, needing no father or mother, no initial spark of tragedy to bring it into being. It exists by itself, an orphaned pain that owes nothing to any particular event. Because this pain is so inherently self-sufficient, Vallejo suggests that no change in external circumstances can alleviate it, even if the worst imaginable things happened. Conversely, if by some miracle life became different, that primal pain would still remain. Quote unquote, if my bride were dead, my suffering would still be the same. If life, in other words, were different, my suffering would still be the same, Vallejo asserts. Today I'm in pain from higher up. Today I am simply in pain. Here, higher up or further down, as he uses in another line, implies that his pain emanates from a place beyond reach, a height or depth of the soul that ordinary remedies or changes cannot touch. This is a pretty astonishing declaration. A pain impervious to circumstance. It is as if he is describing an elemental condition of being, a sorrow that is part of the very atmosphere of existence, or actually more so beyond it. Since the pain comes from higher up or lower down, nothing outside of its grasp could touch it, much less significantly distort it or fix it. Many of us hearing this might ask, why such emphasis on pain? Where is the hope? It is true that up to this point we seem to be immersed in pure despair. One literary critic described Vallejo's I'm going to talk about hope as virtually a hymn to suffering, end quote. The poem unflinchingly sings of pain's universality and depth, and reading it can feel like listening to a dirge with a single droning note of anguish. Vallejo looks at the pain of others, the starving, the heartbroken, and finds even their agonies exist on a different plane from his own. Quote unquote, I look at the hungry man's pain, he says, and I see that his hunger walks somewhere too far from my pain. End quote. The man who starves still has a physical cause for suffering, and perhaps a physical remedy, which is food, or at least the consolation that death will bring a natural end to hunger. Vallejo's pain, by contrast, has no such clear cause or endpoint. He continues on, quote unquote, if I fasted until death, one blade of grass at least would always sprout from my grave. Even in death, life will go on. The grass will still grow. But his point is that his particular pain is of a different order, one that even death doesn't ease in the way dying of hunger might be eased by the grave. And then he goes on, and the same with the lover. He adds, a lover's pain comes from passionate blood, from love and longing. Intense, yes, but comprehensible and even fruitful in its own way. His blood is too fertile for mine, which has no source and no one to drink it. I'm going to repeat that. His blood is too fertile for mine, which has no source and no one to drink it. Vallejo puts in the poem. The suffering of love at least stems from the wellspring of love and can be quenched by love's fulfillment or time's passage. But Vallejo's suffering has no source and no outlet. It is sui generis. It is a breed apart. Up to this stage, Vallejo has effectively isolated his pain as something unique, almost existential in its purity. He then delivers one more stunning image to drive home its singular nature. He reflects, "I always believed that all things in the world had to be either fathers or sons, but here is my pain that is neither a father nor a son. It is an orphan pain, belonging to no lineage of cause and effect. Quote unquote, it hasn't any back to get dark, and it has too bold a front for drawing," he says. And if they put it into some dark room, it wouldn't give light. And if they put it into a brightly lit room, it wouldn't cast a shadow. In other words, his pain is so anomalous that it does not behave as things normally do. It gives off no illumination in darkness and no darkness in light. It does not reciprocate with the world around it. It simply is. And he concludes, "Today I am in pain, no matter what happens. Today I am simply in pain." No matter what happens, whether the world grows bright or dark, whether fortune smiles or tragedies multiply, he is forever in the same state. These are the final notes of that quote-unquote hymn to suffering, sustaining the idea that some pain is absolute and unconditional. At this juncture, you might be thinking that this is a bleak message. Why would a poet call this speaking of hope? Where is the hope in a panorama so entirely filled with inescapable suffering? And this is, of course, a very obvious question, and it is one that Vallejo invites us to ask in this poem. The very title of the piece is, "I am going to talk about hope," which sets up an expectation that this deliberately subverted by the content that is the poem itself. Vallejo was sort of a master of irony and emotional complexity, and by titling his prose poem with hope and then submerging us in despair, he makes us yearn for a resolution. He doesn't hand that light to us outright. Instead, he challenges us to find it ourselves, I think. We have to look at what's written between the lines, so to speak, to discern where hope hides in the suffering. So maybe Vallejo forces us to adjust our eyes to the darkness. So we may have to squint if necessary, and we usually do in our lives, until we catch the faint hints of light that do exist in the poem's imagery and its very existence. And really, to everyone listening, to truly appreciate the subtle hope in Vallejo's message, I am going to recite the poem itself in full. No paraphrase can really equal the power of the full poem. I always like to quote things verbatim because I really want to give credit to the person who actually articulated the thoughts rather than the one reciting the thoughts. And that's why I personally, I like to collect quotations in my pocket or download images of quotes rather than try to trust my memory, because I'm trying to, in a very subtle way, give credit where credit is due. But I digress. So here is César Vallejo's prose poem, "I Am Going to Talk About Hope," in the English translation by Robert Bly. I am going to talk about hope. I do not feel this suffering as César Vallejo. I am not suffering now as a creative person, or as a man, nor even as a simple living being. I don't feel this pain as a Catholic, or as a Mohammedan, or as an atheist. Today I am simply in pain. If my name weren't César Vallejo, I'd still feel it. If I weren't an artist, I'd still feel it. If I weren't a man or even a living being, I'd still feel it. If I weren't a Catholic or an atheist or a Mohammedan, I'd still feel it. Today I am in pain from further down. Today I am simply in pain. The pain I have has no explanations. My pain is so deep that it never had a cause, and has no need of a cause. What could have its cause been? Where is that thing so important that it stopped being its cause? Its cause is nothing, and nothing could have stopped being its cause. Why has this pain been born all on its own? My pain comes from the north wind and from the south wind, like those hermaphrodite eggs that some rare birds lay conceived of the wind. If my bride were dead, my suffering would still be the same. If they had slashed my throat all the way through, my suffering would still be the same. If life, in other words, were different, my suffering would still be the same. Today I'm in pain from higher up. Today I am simply in pain. I look at the hungry man's pain, and I see that his hunger walks somewhere so far from my pain that if I fasted until death, one blade of grass at least would always sprout from my grave. And the same with the lover. His blood is too fertile for mine, which has no source and no one to drink it. I always believe, up till now, that all things in the world had to be either fathers or sons, but there is my pain that is neither a father nor a son. It hasn't any back to get dark, and it hasn't too bold a front for drawing. And if they put it into some dark room, it wouldn't give light. And if they put it into some brightly lit room, it wouldn't cast a shadow. Today I am in pain, no matter what happens. Today I am simply in pain. Translated from the Spanish by Robert Bly. Listening to these words, the only thing that comes to mind is clinical depression. I think it's a very, very, very poetic expression of that. It's almost palpable, and yet I submit to you that hope is indeed present in the poem. It's very quiet, it's implicit, it's subtle, but it's present. Where do we find it? For one, in that small but evocative image we noted earlier, one blade of grass at least would always sprout from my grave. Think about that for a moment. A blade of grass, the simplest, humblest form of life, rising from a grave. A very sophisticated image of renewal, of life continuing even in the wake of death. Vallejo mentions it ostensibly to illustrate how different his pain is from hunger, but the image carries a significance of its own. No matter how barren the scene, life finds a way to persist. In the context of the poem, that blade of grass is a lonely piece of hope. It doesn't negate the pain, it doesn't solve it or explain it, but it does show that something can emerge from the darkest suffering. If not the person who suffers, then perhaps those around or the world at large can still experience growth. The blade of grass is a light in the darkness, albeit a very faint one. We might have to squint to notice it amidst the overwhelming shadow of the poet's pain. But it is there, quietly asserting that despair is not the absolute end. It suggests that even when an individual's hope fails, life's larger impulse to renew itself carries on. And where there's life, of course there's hope. Another place we find hope is in the act of writing and sharing this poem at all. Vallejo's decision to voice his suffering so openly is itself a hopeful act. It means he believed there was value in communication, that there was someone out there, a reader, a future generation, who might understand or at least witness his pain, to speak of one's pain, especially pain that feels pointless and causeless or random, is to reach out across the void of isolation. Vallejo, in pouring these feelings onto paper, I think was reaching out. He was refusing to let his pain remain mute, and in doing so, he was creating a connection with us, his audience, across time and space. That connection of hope, it is a hope that by expressing the truth of his despair, he might foster empathy or solidarity, or simply that he might be heard and not entirely alone in the darkness. As one commentator insightfully noted, the very experience of depression, that seemingly causeless pain, is notoriously difficult to convey. Which is what makes that particular poem worth the struggle. And Vallejo was about nothing if not struggle, which is written by viengativa.com. Vallejo struggled to give words to the wordless weight of depression, and by doing so he cracked open a door for understanding. Every reader who sees their own nameless suffering reflected in Vallejo's words will feel a little less alone. I know I have. In shared understanding, hope takes root. The hope here is that by acknowledging the universality of suffering, we affirm the universality of compassion. We can suffer with each other, which is the literal meaning of compassion, and thereby lighten the burden, even if it's just a little. It is also important to consider César Vallejo's own life and beliefs when searching for the hope in his work. Vallejo was no stranger to hardship. He lived through poverty, injustice, war. He was at one point unjustly imprisoned. He witnessed the ravages of the Spanish Civil War, and he endured chronic illness up until his death. He knew the real concrete forms of suffering that the world can inflict, and yet Vallejo was also a person who held on to ideals. He had a profound compassion for the oppressed and a longing for social justice. Those who study his life often describe him as a man of both Marxist and spiritual convictions, someone who maintained a kind of faith in humanity even while decrying its cruelty. In one of his earlier works, he even proclaims, Tengo fe en ser fuerte, translated, I have faith in being strong, in the midst of a pessimistic book of poems. This hints that Vallejo did harbor a defiant spark of hope, a faith in human strength and our ability to preserve. So when he writes a piece saturated with despair, yet titles, I am going to speak of hope, we can read it as a deliberate, if paradoxical, act of hope. It's as if he's saying, here is the worst of my pain laid bare. I am not going to sugarcoat it or escape it. I will face it directly, and by doing so, by facing the darkest truth, he asserts control over it. There is hope in that assertion. There is hope in the courage to name the nameless horror to illuminate it, even if it itself casts no light or shadow. This courage suggests that Vallejo believed in something beyond the pain, or at least in the importance of searching for something beyond the pain. Now, stepping back from the poem itself, what does this mean for all of us? We started by saying we want to talk about hope and its significance. Vallejo's lesson is that hope is not a simple, sunny optimism that denies suffering. True hope may actually require us to embrace suffering's universality and inevitability first. We cannot really have that hope in any profound sense if we have not acknowledged the depth of human suffering. Otherwise, our hope is just wishful thinking or some shallow comfort. Vallejo shows us the darkest corner of the human heart, but he does so under the banner of hope, implying that hope must encompass even that darkness. Hope, then, is not the absence of pain. It is the resolve to find meaning or light in spite of pain. It can be as small as that blade of grass on a grave, or as tenuous as a voice crying out to unknown listeners. Yet those small things keep us going. Hope often comes disguised as something very modest, a poem, a gesture of empathy, a single breath taken after a long night of working or weeping. It might not dispel the darkness all at once. Sometimes it hardly even defies the darkness, it hardly even wins. We might indeed have to adjust our vision to perceive it, but it's there, and it's definitely present. In reflecting on Vallejo's approach, I am reminded that in our modern lives, we often try to avoid dwelling on pain. It's practical to be optimistic, to focus on solutions, to stay positive, which society obviously encourages that. And truly, in 99 cases out of 100, such pragmatism is necessary for life to function. We cannot wail about existential anguish every minute of the day like I used to. The world would quickly grind to a halt if we all did so. But it is terribly important that there be that one case in 100 where we do something different, where we allow a voice like Vallejo's to ring out purely, unrestrained by the usual caution and platitudes, in planning our endeavors, whether it's art or community or in personal development. We must sometimes take the bold route of acknowledging truth in its rawest form, as Vallejo's poem shows. There is value in occasionally setting aside the questions of practicality or popularity and instead aiming for the most powerful expression possible of our inner reality. Vallejo and his publishers took a risk in putting out such a searing piece of writing, which is really saying, let us build the most powerful poem that is possible in this moment, given the present state of the human heart, and they did. The result is a little challenging, I admit, even for me, but it expands on the boundaries of what we can discuss and feel in the open. It enriches the human dialogue by including experiences that may endure, but few have been able to articulate. The significance of hope, then, in light of all this, is elevated. Hope becomes not just a comforting thought, but a courageous act, too. When Vallejo speaks of hope, he is not talking about a shallow hope that suffering will magically disappear. He is modeling a deeper hope, that by confronting suffering head-on, by sharing it and thereby humanizing it, we forge a path forward in our own life. We can take inspiration from this. And of course, we don't need to be world-famous poets to practice what Vallejo practiced. Another privilege that we all can take advantage of. We only need to be honest with ourselves and others about our pains and our hopes. By doing so, we participate in that same brave tradition. Before I conclude, let me emphasize one more point. Vallejo's poem illustrates that suffering may be universal and inescapable, but it also shows that recognizing this fact is key to compassion. If everyone suffers at some level, then none of us truly suffers alone. Vallejo stripped away the particulars of his identity to show pain in its pure form, but in doing so, he paradoxically made it possible for any reader to identify with him. You do not have to be César Vallejo to feel what he feels, which is exactly the whole point of the poem. By inviting us into this extreme experience, he enlarges our capacity for empathy. And empathy is one of the brightest lights of hope that we can have. When we empathize, we connect hearts. Through connection, we find strength we didn't even know we had. The strength of solidarity. A burden shared becomes lighter. A pain acknowledged by others becomes more bearable. This is not a fanciful ideal. It's something a lot of us have experienced in small ways. Think of a time when you were grieving or in pain and someone simply said, "I hear you, I understand." In that moment, that one tiny comment can be huge in relief. The situation doesn't vanish, but you are no longer in the dark by yourself. In the light of this, Vallejo's I Am Going to Talk About Hope stands as a beacon, albeit a very dimly glowing one, that guides us to a profound truth. Hope can exist alongside despair. In fact, it is often in our darkest moments that hope, if it comes, burns out pure. It may not be the blinding, radiant hope of fairy tales or these very ghastly self-improvement books that infect the shelves. It might instead just be a small, persistent flame that quivers in the draughts of the very enduring nature of life. We have to shield it with our hands, protect it, and sometimes search for it diligently. But once we find it, it sustains us in a way no false optimism ever could. I want to leave you with this thought. Suffering is universal. That is the theme of this series, but so is hope. César Vallejo, through the vehicle of one very extraordinary poem that I feel could do so much good for the world if more people find it. Through this extraordinary poem has taught us that acknowledging the universality of suffering is not a negation of hope. It is actually the starting point for a hope that is much more honest and resilient. It is important for us as individuals and as a society to occasionally do what Vallejo did, to face our collective suffering without disguise and yet affirm the value of striving for something better. As Vallejo titled his poem, "Let us dare to speak of hope even when hope seems most absent." Let us set our standards as high as possible in terms of truth and empathy, and create, in our words and actions, the most powerful beacon of hope that we are capable of with the present state of our mind and our will and emotions. I hope that this kind of courageous honesty and hopefulness will be repeated often in our world and never be forgotten. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this installment of Inalienable Paradise. If you are in some need to talk with or connect with another person, my top resources would be 7cups.com and the Upper Room Crisis Hotline at 1-888-808-8724. And they are both free of charge. And I will top this off with a Carl Sagan adage: even through your hardest days, remember we are all made of stardust.